When I explain to you the difference between strategy and tactics, strategy comes from the Greek word strategos, which means general. So strategia is what a general does, which is to plan battles. Now there's two different levels, and I'll be talking about that during my lecture. Grand strategy is like war strategy. How are we going to win the war? Battle strategy is what am I going to do to win the battle? And then tactics is how you line up your troops, when you fire them, how your troops are equipped at the low bottom level. So today we're going to look at strategy from the British side. Now, I'll circle back to this, but there's no disagreement that the British had better troops, better officers, and better generals, both during the war and at this battle. So why didn't they win? And that's kind of interesting to look at. And then we'll look at the strategy of how they tried to conduct the battle and why they didn't win the battle. So their grand strategy was originally to try to capture Boston because the revolution started in Boston. And they won the Battle of Bunker Hill, which, if you're a good historian of the war, you know was fought on Breed's Hill, which they just celebrated the anniversary of, 250th earlier this summer. But all the Minutemen and the Patriots from New England and even from farther south came up, besieged the British in Boston, and George Washington shows up. Now, Washington clearly is the most key figure of the war. If we hadn't had him, we probably would not have won the war. And let me explain to you how he got appointed. And those who heard my lectures have heard this before, but I'm a teacher. Repetition is great for success. Okay, Molly dance. Molly dance. Good girl. Washington had experience as a commander, a colonel in the Virginia militia, although his experience mainly consisted of the defeat of General Braddock out at Fort Necessity in western Virginia, when Braddock got killed and Washington's army came back in defeat. But he was experienced at least on leading troops. But at the First Continental Congress, he was a delegate from Virginia. He shows up, and all 6'3" of him, an opposing man, in his army uniform. And when they're voting to elect a commander for the American armies, other contenders were, of all people, John Hancock. Yeah, from up in Boston, rich merchant who signed in big letters the Declaration of Independence so that King George could see without his reading glasses. Charles Lee, who's the scapegoat of this battle, wanted to be commander. And there were some others who wanted to be commander. Why did they elect George Washington? 2 or 3 reasons. One was this military experience, even though it wasn't the best. Secondly, he offered to serve for no pay if nominated. And they were going to take him up on that. And there was a neat book published called George Washington's Expense Account that he got his expenses paid, which turned out being more than what his pay would have been, because he invited Mrs. Washington to come stay with him every couple months, and they had to have their Madeira and their fresh linens and whatnot. So he made out pretty good at that, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. But thirdly, they wanted to get Virginia more involved in the war because Virginia is the biggest province. So the fates came together and elected George Washington commander of the army. He goes up to Boston and chases the British out. By the way, Washington, I give talk on every year in February because that's his birthday month, turned out to be a great choice because he was unwilling ever to admit defeat. Then he becomes our first president, not just because he was a great general. If you look at American presidents, generals don't always make good presidents. Look at Grant. Even Eisenhower was okay. Just because you can lead an army doesn't mean you can lead a country. Why did they pick George Washington for president? He won the war, yes, but he had no sons. So there was no danger of him setting up a dynasty. So everything worked out well, and it also worked out well that we didn't lose this battle, and he kept his job, but we'll talk about that later. If I get talking too fast, raise your hand, and I can talk a little louder, but if you have a hearing issue, it's better probably sit up front. So anyway, the British strategy, the first grand strategy, was capture Boston. They didn't. They had to leave, evacuate. And Washington won that. And actually during the war, he only won 4 battles. His record as a commander was 4 wins, 8 losses, 1 tie. The 2 wins were the Siege of Boston in 1775, the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, and what I call the 2 sneak attacks at Princeton and Trenton at mid-war. The 1 tie was here at Monmouth. If he was the commander or the coach of the New York Jets, he would have been fired before the season ended with a 4-8-1 record. But he kept his command largely because he didn't lose here. So what's the British strategy after they capture Boston and have to leave? Okay, their second strategy is to go down and take New York City, which they could do because New York City, Manhattan was an island, and British have a big fleet. We have a terrible fleet. The French have a decent fleet, although they seldom defeated the British. And what's ironic is the only naval battle they beat the British in 100 years was the Battle of the Virginia Capes right before Yorktown, because the French fleet defeated the British fleet, and then Cornwallis's army at Yorktown could not get evacuated, and that's why they had to surrender. So we were lucky on that. So they captured New York City. Washington was probably foolish to try even to defend it. How can you defend Long Island and Manhattan when they're islands and you don't have a fleet? So we really got beat up. And the irony is, while Congress was voting independence on July 4th, 1776, Washington was getting the crap beat out of him in New York City. So British strategy, take New York, good idea. Now, what do you do next? Okay, they want to, what they call, cut off the head of the snake, which is separate New England. They couldn't capture New England because they lost Boston. But they tried to capture New England. How are we going to do that? Okay, we're going to have a plan to send the army from New York up the Hudson River, bring another army down under General Burgoyne from Canada, down through Canada, and actually a third army in from Buffalo under a guy named St. Longer. And these 3 armies would meet at Albany, and they would cut off New England, and that would end the war. Good idea? Yeah, sounds okay. Problem is, this kind of grand strategy is hard to do in an age when you don't have electronic communications. All these armies were not communicating with each other. Any orders had to go to London and then come back. And I actually wrote a paper on this when I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan in a graduate level history course on the main British problem in the war was not troops, not number of troops, but communications. And the key to that was General Howe, who had the main army in New York, decides, no, I don't want to do that, I'm going to do this. And instead of Howe going up to Albany to cut off the head of the snake, he packs up and goes down and attacks Philadelphia. So this grand strategy for 1777 doesn't work. And without Howe going up the Hudson, Burgoyne's army coming down from Canada got trapped at Saratoga. And significance of that to the Martin family is one of my great-great-great ancestors was in the 8th Massachusetts Regiment, got captured in one of the skirmishes before Saratoga and actually died in a British prison camp. Uh-oh, she's okay. Yeah. You just surprised her probably. And fortunately he had his children before then, he was 51. Otherwise I wouldn't be here today. So Molly wants another treat. So this is the last one, Molly girl. You're interrupting. Okay, this is when you go to sleep. Okay, come on, Molly. Okay, we call this a Molly timeout. Okay, Molly dance. Molly dance. Okay, good girl. Okay, now that's the last one. You behave yourself. So that's strategy number 2 didn't work. Okay, strategy number 3, grand strategy, is Howe's attack on Philadelphia. He got all the fleet together and took off for Philadelphia. He actually sailed down to the mouth of the Delaware River and came up that way, won the Battle of Brandywine down in Delaware, captures Philadelphia. Now, by European standards, if you capture the enemy capital, the war should be over. Okay, when Napoleon captures Warsaw, when Napoleon captures Berlin, although the exception was he captured Moscow but lost that one. If the Allied armies capture Paris, the war is over. We were too dumb to realize that. Okay, the British came under Howe and captured Philadelphia, and what does Congress do? They packed up and moved to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Okay, and they spent the Congress was there. American Army's going to be the winner at Valley Forge. The British are all encamped in the hotels in Philadelphia, having a good time. That strategy didn't work either. So British grand strategy for the war is not working. Okay. The British are in Philadelphia. The problem is, besides the communications I mentioned, is they don't have enough manpower, and they didn't realize how big America is. England is a small place. If you get an army together, or even two, you can defeat the Scots, or the Welsh, or the Irish, because they aren't that big. In America, because it's so big, the British do not have the manpower, even with the help of their German friends, the Hessians, the mercenaries, to hold more than 2 cities at the same time. Boston and New York and Philadelphia, the campaign that's coming up, New York and Charleston. They just don't have enough men to do that. Now, the war probably would have ended up in a, did she have that bone done already, you little pig dog? Okay. The war probably would have ended in a draw much sooner, except the French now formally come into the war because of Saratoga. And when they come into the war, the whole nature of the war, instead of being a revolution, an insurrection in America, has now become a world war. And the British are well aware that they have possessions that are much more valuable than America, like India, the Indies, the Spice Islands. And once it becomes a world war, they can't pay as much attention to what's going on over here. So after Monmouth, and this is another important effect of Monmouth, besides that George Washington was not defeated and fired, was that they changed their whole war strategy, fourth strategy of the war, to go down to the south. And they send an army under General Cornwallis down to the south, and it captures Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina, and then chase General Lafayette around, and they end up at a place called Yorktown that they tried to fight in the south, where in general the landowners and the Americans were more friendly to their cause. They recruited black troops, but they still couldn't win the war because it's underpopulated down there with the big plantations. And as I mentioned, they end up at Yorktown, and because the French had won the Battle of the Virginia Capes, they couldn't get any relief fleet in. They had to surrender. Second time the British lost an army, and it was just becoming too costly to run this war. Even though it took them, that was 1781, it took them 2 more years to make the treaty, but they end up giving us our independence in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. And what's cool is not only did America get their 13 colonies, we also got the British possessions out to the Mississippi River, the stuff on the other side of the Appalachians, because the British didn't want the French to get it. What we did not get from the war was the 14th colony, Canada. We tried twice to invade Canada, that didn't work. We tried again in 1812, that didn't work. That's why Canada is a separate country. And even though President Trump wants to make it into a state, I argue with him, and I almost sent a letter to him, but I said it would get me too much press. We don't want to make Canada into a state, we want to make it into many states. Now, what my plan is, that we're going to have to make Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. into states eventually. Okay, that makes 52. How many states can we make out of Canada? 12. Why?
Provinces?
That's the approximate number of provinces they have now. And I have plans to change some of the names of the provinces, like Prince Edward Island. We can't have no prince because we all have royalties here. Okay, we want 12 because 12 plus 2 plus 50 is what? 64. 8 rows of 8 stars, perfection, no more. And that's what we're going to do. Eventually. I may not be around then, but I need to put this in my will or write General Trump or whoever comes after him, that when we take Canada, we're not going to make it into 1 state. We need to make it into 12 states, which will probably go Republican, which is the trade-off for making Puerto Rico and D.C. will definitely be Democrat. But it's still a net game of 10 states. And that means the Republicans can control the Senate, which is one reason the Civil War came around in 1860. Is that as the country expanded to the west, the new western states didn't have slaves, so the South couldn't get more senators to control Congress. And as you see, the causes of the Civil War, which I'll also give lectures on, are politically based. Over control of the government, slavery, trade, government investing in the railroads were all issues that were in Congress that the Republicans are pushing because they now have a majority of the states, because it's just, you can't have many slaves in Montana. It's just not economical. So anyway, I wander from the truth here. I'm supposed to be talking to you about British strategy. So British grand strategy in the war, all forms of it did not work because of the size of America, the limited number of troops they had, the French intervention, and it just started costing too much money. And the British were still paying for the revolution when Napoleon pops up. And they were lucky they had a lot of European allies to help with Napoleon, because otherwise they would not have had the manpower or the money to defeat the French. Actually, and Napoleon defeated himself by invading Russia. So, the strategies again. Capture Boston, didn't work. They got kicked out of Boston. Cut off the head of the snake by capturing Albany, didn't work because Howe decided to go to Philadelphia. Capture Philadelphia, didn't work because we were too dumb, we could just invade another capital, no problem. And then their fourth grand strategy was to go south, which sort of worked. They did capture the southern states, but by then the war was dragging on and Cornwallis had bad luck. And Washington made the quick decision that to have Lafayette, who's still, and it's just in his mid-20s, just wear the British out by marching all over Virginia. And then he quit once the French army came here, made a quick decision to march down from northern New Jersey, where he's keeping an eye on New York, down to Virginia. He made a very quick, hard march to get down there to catch the British before they could fight their way out on the land side. So Washington made some good strategic decisions there. So why didn't the British win the war? Those are major reasons that happened. Now, if Washington had been killed, I think it probably would have been a draw earlier. There's a story that at the Battle of Princeton, Washington rode in front of the troops to line them up, and the British were like 20 yards away, and the British commander said, "Don't shoot, because you don't shoot at enemy commanders. It's not nice." The British officers felt closer to the American officers than they did to their own troops, who were, lower class type people. Although we worked the other way. One reason we run Saratoga is Daniel Murphy, a sharpshooter, said, "See that British commander over there, like 4 football fields away? Got his rifle up, bing, got him." And we cheated, and we had a sharpshooter shoot their general, and we won the battle. So I guess any way you win is fair. I guess as long as you win. I won't get into that discussion. So what's going on? That's the grand strategy of the war. Why didn't the British win? They had better officers, better troops. They made decent plans, but America's too big and Washington won't give up. Now let's look at what's happening here at Monmouth. And the British knew the French fleet was coming. They didn't want to get trapped in Philadelphia. The French fleet came and sailed up towards Havre de Grace and the lower Delaware. The British couldn't have gotten out, so they left before the French fleet got here. They sent a lot of their supplies and weaker troops by boat back to New York. The British loved New York. Even after half of New York burnt down accidentally. Yeah, okay. They loved New York with all its bars and loose women and all kinds of stuff. And it was easy to get to. And they were very reluctant to abandon New York at the end of the war. So they're going back to New York. Their best troops were in 2 divisions. The Grenadiers and Guards and everybody in the 1st Division under General Cornwallis, and the German troops under von Knyphausen, who was the Hessian commander, 2nd command of the British Army. And they're going to cross the river down at Camden and essentially come up the turnpike. Of course, turnpike's not here yet, and head towards New York City. The original plan was to march up towards Perth Amboy and cross over to Staten Island from there, but General Clinton was very concerned that Washington's army down at Philadelphia would link up with Gates's army in New York and come down to beat him up. So he takes a more southern route, which brings him here to Monmouth Courthouse. And Washington was wise in not following the British straight up the Knot Turnpike, but he crosses farther up near Washington's Crossing, comes across Hopewell, Cranberry. The British are here. Washington's here to intercept them if they do take a northern course. although the American militia is following the British and keeping Washington very well in contact with where the British are going. So they show up here at Monmouth Courthouse and rest a couple days. And British strategy right now is to force a battle with the Americans. Because Americans tend not to win pitched battles. Remember, Washington's record is 4-8-1, and he did not win a pitched battle in the whole war. But after waiting a couple days, Washington didn't come. So on the morning of the 28th of June, 1778, the British start evacuating Monmouth Courthouse. Around 4 in the morning, the Hessian Division starts marching off Dutch Lane towards Colt's Neck. Around 7, the main division starts marching out. And in between, the British have a wagon train of around 10 miles full of their supplies and heavy cannons and stuff that they stole along the way. And they're being harassed all the time by the American militia. And the American militia, in general, we don't trust the militia, especially in some of the southern battles. Militia will keep you informed of where the British are because they know the roads and the territory. Militia hang out in the fields and the trees beyond the line of march. So if you're, pardon the French, any young ones here, okay, have to go to the bathroom during the line of march and go off into the woods and drop your drawers, you might get shot or captured, and that happened regularly. So the British preferred not to because they didn't want to get out of sight of their own troops, so they're going to get shot or captured. And the British lost more deserters from the Germans during the force of the march than they did casualties at the battle. And these Germans can then intermingle with the Germans here, or like a lot of the Hessians that got captured at Trenton, they end up joining their friends over in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and intermingle with the Americans, become American. So the British are encamped here, and this is their first strategy, and their strategy in the battle wasn't bad. They leave a rear guard of around 1,500 men just on the north edge of town, and Clinton goes about a mile out the other side of what's called Briar Hill, if you know the area, beyond Dutch Lane, and he forms, and this will be on map number, one that's called 257. This is the morning part of the battle, but Clinton is off map in the upper right corner, and there's a neat account of how they were in a field of rye. And he has his whole army in the shape of a V with the cannons at the middle, waiting for the Americans to attack. So, why aren't the Americans attacking? Because Washington's aware Americans don't attack well. Okay, they tried it a couple of times in the war, especially at Germantown, outside of Philadelphia. We just don't attack well. We defend okay, we just don't attack well. And Washington has a decent battle plan. Again, he was heading, not following the British, but trying to intercept them. He had stopped on the 27th or 26th, 2 days before the battle, over on Gravel Hill in Monroe Township. We used to run tours out there. We'll probably have some more scheduled, keep track of that from our website. And formed on Gravel Hill, which is a very defensible position with a stream at the bottom, both for defense and for water. It's the other side of Englishtown. So if the British attacked him, he'd have a good defense. And he decided to send a force out to see what the British were doing, and if they didn't do well, he was able to come to help them, and that's actually what happened in the battle. So the morning of the battle, General Charles Lee, who is the scapegoat of the battle, and we give a lecture on him every year, leads his command, the advance force of the American Army, about 4,500 troops, into Monmouth Courthouse. And he should have, with his 4,500 men, been able to defeat that British rear guard of 1,500 just in the center of Monmouth Courthouse. But Lee, being Lee, and having read too many history books, wants to be fancy. And instead of attacking the British head on, he sends one force under General Wayne around with a left hook, and that's what's showing on that map of 257. The Americans are in the lighter, and I apologize, it's a little harder to read, but you can see Wayne at the top of the map. He's in a left hook. Lafayette is sent in a right hook to take Monmouth Courthouse, and he was going to beat that rear guard. The problem was that the British or the American riflemen under Colonel Van Morgan, most of the troops have regular muskets. Now you're all aware you got to load your muskets from this end. Regular muskets will shoot about 40 yards and you can't hit what you're shooting at. That's why they all line up shoulder to shoulder. The rifles, they do have Daniel Boone style muskets where you can pick a squirrel out of a tree at 100 yards. They got the bright idea of putting them all into one unit under Colonel Morgan, and he's camped down south of Monmouth Courthouse near the Burger King, if you're familiar with the area, and he receives orders that morning from General Lee, attack the British rear in the morning. Now, problem is Colonel Morgan got those orders around 6 in the morning, and he had been up all night. And when he read the orders in the morning, attack the British rear, he thought the orders were for the next day, the 29th, because Lee forgot to timestamp the order. So he sat there and did nothing until later in the battle, when he hears the fighting and he sends some messenger up to the battle, see what's going on, runs into General Wayne. Wayne says, "We aren't doing well, fend for yourself." Thank you, General Wayne. So Lee has too complicated a plan. He wants to entrap the British with a left hook, right hook, rear guard attack. The rear guard attack doesn't work. Lafayette has 4 regiments to attack the British left. He leads the lead one. He's like 21, 22 years old, full of energy and vigor. He leads them too fast, and by the time he gets there, there's only 1 regiment with him. The other 3 couldn't keep up and ended up going back into the woods for cover. And Lafayette said, "Oops," and the right wing has to pull back. The left wing attack under General Wayne goes almost too far and gets cut off. And at this point, the whole attack unravels. Now, if we had won or done better, I think the British rear guard could have fought their way out of town. And when you look at that map in the center right, you see Cornwallis and where the British rear guard is, because they would fall back to where Clinton is, which is sort of what they eventually did. And then when that force, which is only 1/3 or so, 40% of the American army, was confronted with Clinton's whole force up where those 2 arrows are in the upper right of map 257. They would have got beat up because they would have been really outnumbered. So what actually happened next, even though Clinton had a good idea to sucker the Americans into an attack and then counterattack them, the attack fell apart from Lee. Lafayette's troops started withdrawing. The troops that were in the center of the American position were ordered not to be too much fire too much, because they make the British go away. So they just went and hid in the went into the woods because it was hot. Well, nobody else could see them, including General Maxwell, Scott's Willie Maxwell, commander of the New Jersey Brigade. Where'd the center go? They thought it retreated. Well, they were moving back just to get into the shade of the trees. So they started withdrawing on their own. Wayne got in trouble on the upper left. He starts withdrawing, and before you know it, the whole American army is heading back to where they started from. Now, one thing we learned from General von Steuben at Valley Forge is how to retreat in good order. Americans were good retreaters, could get lots of practice at that. Now, it's overestimated what von Steuben did. Troops that we had at Valley Forge were veteran troops. She's more entertaining than I am, isn't she? Were veteran troops. They were not raw militia. Steuben retrained them in order to be able to fight as interchangeable units and have a common command system, which is a problem they had, that different states had different commands. So he made the veteran troops fight even better. So as Lee's troops withdrew, they withdrew in good order. They did not run. Now, we were actually lucky that Lee got a late start that morning and did not attack when he was supposed to at Monmouth Courthouse, because he would have run into the whole British army and been soundly defeated. Okay. When the American army disintegrated on its own, Clinton's strategy didn't work for that part of the battle, but he does win the morning part of the battle. So British strategy for the battle is going well. Now what happens is Lee's troops withdraw back towards the area where we are now, where the park is. And Clinton follows them. Now, as he follows them, he will follow them more directly. Now, if you know the battle area, I trust most of you are lucky or familiar with the battle area. About 1/3 of the American army came down Route 522 from town towards the battle area. 2/3 under General Lee will come down from basically where the Kia store is on Route 1 down here. They're about half a mile apart. Clinton will follow the lower group, the bigger group, which I guess makes sense, but this is a strategic mistake because around 12:15, Washington shows up on the battle. The morning part of the battle was fought without Washington present. He had stayed back at Gravel Hill, but had the troops ready to march if needed. He did actually start some troops in motion towards Englishtown. Meanwhile, he went for brunch in Englishtown at the home of Dr. James English. Now, what's cool is Englishtown is not named Englishtown because it got founded by Englishmen. Kind of like German, not unlike Germantown, PA, which was founded by German people. Englishtown is named after two brothers named English. And the biggest house in Englishtown is Dr. James English's on the northeast corner of town near the McDonald's and the flea market. And Washington's there having brunch. And he had got a note back from General Lee, battle going well, okay. And he sent a note, Washington sent a note to Congress in Philly, battle's going well. Then around a little before noon, he starts hearing cannon shots where there shouldn't be cannon shots. So he hops on his pony and rides into the battlefield. And as he comes down the battlefield, this is an interesting talk that I give called George Washington at Monmouth Minute by Minute, he runs into a fifer, wounded troops, a colonel he knew well, and he sees more and more what we call in military term flotsam and jetsam. Okay, these are the people retreating to the back from the initial contact. He runs into General Lee over here on Wemrock Road, and we have a third tour that we're developing there that will be a self-guiding tour for that area, and we want to have that installed for the anniversary coming up. And asks General Lee, according to most versions, it's, sir, what is all this confusion? I think that's the Victorian cleansed version. I think he said, what the hell's going on here? And some of the sources say that he swore at Lee until the leaves on the trees were shaking. Well, that the source for that wasn't close enough to hear the words, though I might have heard the leaves shaking, seen the leaves shaking. Our Victorian ancestors would say that General Washington does not swear. If you come to my talk on George Washington's sense of humor, he is a Virginia fox hunter. He probably knows how to swear in at least 4 different foreign languages. And he makes an important decision not to abandon the battlefield. We very easily could have at noon on the day of the battle, we lost the morning, just pull back to Gravel Hill, and he'd now be 4-9-0 instead of 4-8-1. But he decides to stay there and asks Lee to form a defensive line over here, what's called the hedgerow at the center of the battlefield, which is walking tour number 1. Clinton's first decision in the battle said to form those troops up near Briar Hill in case the Americans would attack. Good decision. When he follows them up, mistake, and it's always easier as a Monday morning quarterback. He should have sent more troops on the northern wing than left, because if he sent them on the northern wing, he probably would have cut Washington off or ran into him over near Tennant Church. But he didn't. He followed the main force of the Americans to the hedgerow here. Lee does hold that for a while, and Washington made the critical decision to stay on the battlefield. He wasn't cowed. He said, we can fight you guys. And he saw what a strong position it was there at what's called Prime Hill over by Tennant Church. This is much like, if you're an aficionado of the Civil War in Gettysburg, which I've written a lot about, when on the first day of the battle, July 1st, 1863, the Union troops marched through Gettysburg and formed north and west of town and got defeated. But when they pulled back, they knew where Cemetery Hill was because they had crossed it on the way to the battlefield. These troops had crossed Prime Hill on the way to where they were fighting in Monmouth Courthouse and knew how to get back there. So Washington will have a strong defensive position on Prime Hill, which is about 1.25 miles up that way, and the British come up and face them around 1 o'clock. Now, what are you going to do with the British? This is part 2 of the battle. When you have your troops here and the American troops here, are you going to attack them head on? No. Because the British learned their lesson from Bunker Hill, that you don't attack the Americans head on. That was the heaviest British battle casualties of the war. Yes, they had heavier casualties at Yorktown and at Yorktown because that was a siege. But you don't attack the Americans head on. Americans, when they're in a strong position, good troops and cannons, you're going to get clobbered. So what do? You line your troops up facing the Americans and fire your cannons at them. And this went on for 2 hours, and this is when Molly Pitcher gets involved, but that's another lecture. While you're firing at the Americans, what do? You go around them. This happened at the Battle of Long Island. Get the American attention, fire cannons at them, and the British swept around the American flank through an unguarded pass and won the Battle of Long Island pretty convincingly. It worked even better at Brandywine. Line up your troops, see the American troops, shoot at them, and send somebody with a hook around them. Well, Brandywine. So here at Monmouth, the British strategy now will be line up, shoot at Molly Pitcher for a while, and send some troops around against the American left. We're on the American left. If the British had gotten to this hill, and if you go outside after the lecture, this is a very strong position. It's a high hill, there's a stream at the base, it's muddy, very good position. If the British had got here first, they would have outflanked the American position and driven us off the field. The American line is up there, coming down to here. What happened is we have the home field advantage. One of the colonels of the militia lived on the battlefield, told Washington about this hill, and Washington put some troops here. So starting around 1:32 o'clock on the day of the battle, there will be 600 to 800 Virginia troops here, including John Marshall, the first future head of the American Supreme Court, was with the troops, and 4 cannons are lined up on this hill. We got here first. And what's neat is we actually know what size cannons these were, because I happened to find on eBay about 10 years ago a cannonball found on this hill. And that was cool. It's an American cannonball from this hill. And the cannons that were here were supposed to be 4-pounder cannons. Cannons are judged by the weight of the bowling ball that they solid shot that they shoot. Well, I got enterprising, and I had a small collection of cannonballs that's on display in the gift shop. And I had my science teacher at the school I work at weigh them. And behold, this cannonball that was found here on Holmes's Hill weighed 5.4 pounds. I said, wait a minute, there's no such thing as a 5-pounder cannon. There's 3s, 4s, 6s, 9s, 12s, and 24s. There's no 5s. What the heck's going on? So I did some research, and I've contributed this to the park staff that's writing a history of American artillery in the war. Apparently in the 1700s, there were 3 different weight systems in Europe. A French system, a British system, and a Swedish system. It's kind of like, metric and pounds and ounces, okay, different. The Swedish weight system was heavier than the American system, and 4 pounds Swedish equals 5.4 pounds English. So what this shows is, not only were there 4-pounder cannons on this hill, they were Swedish 4-pounders because of the weight of the cannonball. That's pretty cool. And I had that confirmed by an artillery expert that came by 1 year. So we have that over displayed at the gift shop. But anyway, to make a long story short, we got to this hill before the British did. So their left hook didn't work. So what are you going to do? Do a right hook. Keep your army lined up, you shoot at Molly Pitcher over on Bryan Hill, and we're send some of our better troops around Craig Road and around the north side of the American wing. Washington knew they might do that. And he sent General Lafayette with some troops over between Tennant Church and the now planned Englishtown High School to guard that. Now my theory is, as that flanking force went down Craig Road, there's a bunch of streams, it's kind of mucky and swampy over just north of Old Tennant Church. I think they got held up by the topography, but they couldn't get around us there. If they did get by the streams there, they would have run into Lafayette. That didn't work either. So the mid-battle strategy of left hook or right hook, but no center attack, didn't work. Okay. By then, the British are getting a little tired. Everybody's been up fighting since dawn. And they start withdrawing. And behold, Washington mounts a counterattack. Ooh, very brave. And Colonel Silly takes a couple regiments on the north side, and they counterattack the British as they withdraw. And as neat as they went through the Sutphen Orchard, which you can actually see, it's exactly a mile away where the Sutphen House is. There were dead British grenadiers in an orchard. We had never seen dead British before. We had never won a battle that the British grenadiers were in, and we're winning. the afternoon part of the battle. And that's pretty cool. So Clinton's plan is just to go into camp. They're tired. Okay, so at this point, around 3, 4 in the afternoon, our friend General Wayne, oh, by the way, I didn't mention the second map, but if you look at the map that says 334 on it, the British are in the center, right, where the A with the arrows is, that's the plan of flanking attack to Combs's Hill, and you can see there on the center left, lower, the 4 cannons and the American troops on Combs's Hill, which is where we are. The B is the second attack around the American left, where they got bogged down over by Lieutenant Church and Lafayette. The main British Army is in the middle, the American Army is on the top. You can see all the cannon sights up there at the top. These maps are available on our website in living color. What's cool is Dr. Gary Stone, who was the historian here for quite a while, who wrote a book called Bloody Sunday, which we have in the gift shop, had all the maps for that, but then he corrected them and colorized them. And we have on our Monmouth Battlefield Friends website color versions of these maps if you want to follow the battle in more detail. Thank you, Dr. Stone. So they go into camp. General Wayne, who's the main officer who's involved in all 3 parts of the battle, the morning fight, the over Briar Hill fight, and then the noon fight. And in the afternoon, says the British are retreating, let's counterattack them. Washington says, no, our guys are tired. And Wayne says, well, give me half the army and I'll attack them. No. So he finally gets permission to take like 2 regiments. And General Wayne advances across the battlefield, across the hedgerow, which captured, changed hands 7 times during the battle, finds the British Grenadiers going into camp over near Battlefield Orchards. Now, they hadn't eaten all day, so they're in camp fixing their meal for the day. And General Wayne shows up and says, what should he have done is say, oh, there's the British having their meal. I'll go tell General Washington and let him decide what to do. No, what Wayne does is he attacks them. Oh boy. So British were kind of mad. The Grenadiers are the best troops in the army. They counterattack him and drive him all the way back to the parsonage here on the center of the battlefield. Wayne should have gotten his butt kicked. But because of the way Washington had set up the army, now maybe it was accidental, but we have 4 cannons on this hill, and they have 10 cannons over with Molly Pitcher on the north side, and the British were in the middle. They were catching fire from both sides, and decided not to attack anymore, withdrew back to Route 9 to go into camp for the night. Washington's plan for the rest of the battle, he put troops together on the center of the battlefield to renew the battle in the morning on the 29th. The British pull a George Washington. Now, when I say pull a George Washington, when the Americans escaped from Long Island in 1776, he got all the boats together. It sounds like Washington crossing the Delaware. This one's a retreat, not an attack. And they used the Marblehead Regiment from Massachusetts and crossed Long Island Sound, or whatever it is there, back to Manhattan. They were aided by a heavy fog that night, and they all got away. But you leave the campfires burning and make a lot of noise and like you're there. So the British left their campfires burning that night while they sneaked away like the cowards they are up to Colt's Neck. And when we got to attack in the morning, nobody was there. So the battle is technically a draw. So in the remainder of the campaign, British still have good strategy. They marched pretty hard to get up to what they called the Heights of Middletown. And the Heights of Middletown, which are 12 miles or something northeast there of Freehold, on the north side of it, I love the name Nut Swamp, which is very swampy. I don't know about the nuts. They were hoping the Americans would attack them there. Washington's guys were tired. He did send Colonel Morgan, who hadn't been in the battle yet, and the militia up there, but Morgan got tired himself. The militia didn't want to do much, so nothing really happened. So the British defended Middletown. I think the only thing they did was the Presbyterian church up there, they put their horses in it and desecrated the whole church, and eventually went up to Sandy Hook, which is interesting because Sandy Hook then was an island. There had been a storm that separated Sandy Hook from the mainland. They didn't know, weren't anticipating that, so they had to ferry the troops across from near Middletown onto Sandy Hook, and then they ferried the troops from Sandy Hook over to Staten Island. And that's the end of the campaign. The Americans did not follow them because Morgan gave up on it. Washington will take his troops up to New Brunswick and then up to northern New Jersey, and we get into a whole different battle. So the battle is a draw, and as I hinted earlier, Washington didn't lose. And what's interesting is that his staff officers, mainly Alexander Hamilton and a fellow named John Lawrence, who was working on Washington's staff because it's handy to have him there because his father is the president of the Continental Congress. When they wrote up the battle reports, it sounded like we won. And I give this as a lesson to my students that sometimes it's not so much what happened as what you are told or think happened. And they went through 3 different versions of this battle report, and every time there's more British casualties reported and less Americans. So we celebrated a victory at Monmouth, which was really a draw. And the British will then be back in New York and again change their whole grand strategy for the war and try to win the war by taking the South. So the topic here then was, British strategy at Monmouth. Why didn't they win? They had better generals, they had better troops, they had more troops. Okay, neither side committed their whole army in this battle. They both had reserves they didn't use, especially the British. If Clinton wanted to, he could have stayed on the 29th and probably gone up north and gotten around the American army over towards the area of Princeton and cut them off. But his main goal was to get his troops safely back to New York. And that he did. So in that regard, the British will say they won the battle because Monmouth was just a rear guard or a holding action, and they got their army back to New York safely. Although Monmouth is not just a skirmish, it is the largest, longest one-day land battle of the war. It's just the British decided not to fight it out. It's kind of like if General Lee at Gettysburg won the first day and then left. Okay, they won the morning of the battle, they lost the second and third days. It's interesting to posit what might have happened had the battle lasted longer, but Clinton didn't want a pitched battle here. He was going to try to catch Washington, which he did in the morning, but it didn't work out in the afternoon. Washington wanted to catch the British rearguard, which didn't work because of General Lee, who will get court-martialed. So, why didn't the British win the battle in spite of having better generals, better men, and a decent strategy? Okay, to form all his troops north of town and then counterattack worked. To form his cannons up and then attack with a left and a right, it didn't work because Washington, for once, and the only time in the war, figured him out. So we had a home field advantage. Washington understood the terrain better than the British did. And good generals need to understand the terrain, the hills and the streams, in order to be successful. Why didn't the British understand the terrain? I guess bad scouting. They'd been here for 2 days. Or he was in a hurry. Or my ultimate conclusion is he didn't think it was worth it. He wanted to get back to New York and then they could start over and do next year's campaign. So again, the battle is technically a draw, and the Americans wrote it up as a victory, and Washington gets to stay in command, also, partly because he didn't lose the battle, but secondly because I lost my train of thought there. That Washington did not commit defeat here, but General Charles Lee, who was the second in command and wanted to take command of the army, is going to disappear because he gets court-martialed after the battle and gets fired. So Washington will not be contested for the rest of the war. That keeps us in the war, and the new strategy in the South didn't work, and the French show up, and Washington takes advantage of that to defeat the British at Yorktown. So this is a neat battle. It's one of the more complicated ones to understand because we don't have a lot of sources for it. I've written a lot on Civil War battles in that troops, officers, regiment level and up had to do battle reports. And they tell us what happened. They didn't require battle reports here. Yes, Washington had an official report written by Colonel Hamilton. We have sources from some of the generals, but the American Army is not as illiterate as Civil War times. I would say literacy at the time of the Civil War in Union armies has to be 90%. We have their letters. We know what was going on. Literacy here, I don't know. We're lucky maybe to hit 50%, to be honest. Or they just didn't have time or keep it up. The sources on the battle are hard to understand. Our best sources are the battlefield itself, and we still do archaeology work on it. We're digging up the cannonballs and the musket balls. But the best single source on the battle, other than the battlefield itself, is the court-martial of Lee, at least for the morning part of the battle. Because in the month after the battle, the generals met and heard testimony, and somebody wrote it all down and published it, of who was doing what all morning long. And it's, I'm trying to get a book written on that, I haven't gotten around to it yet, but to analyze the court-martial papers and what they tell us about the battle. But the first half of the battle, we pretty much know what was going on from these records. But other than that, especially in the afternoon, it's hard to figure out exactly what's going on. We know in general what's going on, but bottom line, British didn't win. So that's why did the British strategy at the battle fail? Bad luck. Again, Clinton, I guess bottom line, he didn't think it was worth staying a second day. First day was a draw. That doesn't mean you can't fight a second day. But his goal, again, was to get the wagon train out of town, get back to New York. He did that, so in his eyes, he did win. In our eyes, he didn't. Okay, so that's my talk. And I'm a school teacher. I hit an hour on the spot, didn't I? Be glad to field questions, either in general now or afterwards, and I'll get over to the gift shop when I'm done here. Okay, over here.
Yes. You talked about the British. Did they have any documentation? Did anyone on their side submit a battle report that you were able to review?
General Clinton did, and it was more a campaign report. And what's interesting is he's filed it when he got back to New York, and it was published in a London newspaper. And then, like we do now with the AP, another paper pirated and published it, and we actually own a copy of that, of his original battle report. And he does not treat the battle as a big deal.
So he didn't indicate whether they won, lost, draw?
No, he said what he did and how many men were here and who the casualties were and who the officer casualties were, but it was just part of a general campaign. Now, when I did my book on, they asked me to write a book on Monmouth, I said, well, look, it's not really, it's part of the campaign. The Philadelphia campaign is ebb and flow. The British go down, they win Brandywine, they win Germantown, they hold Philadelphia, they come back, they fight at Crosswicks, they fight a big action at Monmouth, and then they go up there. So Monmouth is the tail end, maybe 1/3 of this whole 2-year campaign. I don't think the British saw it as a big deal. We do, but the British didn't. But he did file a report, but it wasn't on the battle, it was on the campaign. Okay, the question over here, yes.
Which type of armament played a greater role in the afternoon part of the battle on the part of the Americans? Was it the cannons, was it the muskets, or was
Well,
it...
it's definitely the cannons. In the morning part, I know that's part of your question, the casualties were all caused by cannons because nobody got close enough together, at least over on Briar Hill, to even fire muskets at 30 or 50 yards. What controls the ebb and flow of a cannon, of a battle, is the cannons. It's not just prejudice, because my great-grandfather was in a battery from Michigan in the Civil War. Cannons have greater range, up to half a mile or more, but the heaviest British casualties were over on what I have christened in the name stuck Oswald's Knoll, over in the north end of the hedgerow. When the Grenadiers broke through the American line around 12:30, and were trying to get through to capture the only bridge going back to Englishtown, they made a dash for the bridge. We had 4 cannons, then 2 on top of the hill. They're firing grape shot. The normal weaponry of the cannons, and most of the Americans are 3s and 4s. The British tend to be 4s and 6s. I think they have 1 12-pounder on the battlefield. That's the weight of the cannonball. And these are solid shot, not the ones that explode. They're used against other cannons, buildings, horses, and solid bodies of men, solid masses of men. The heaviest casualties will be caused by grape shot, which is round shot the size of a grape. They go in a little tubey thing, 10 or 12 in it. You load it in a cartridge. They have an example of it here in the museum, and that works like a shotgun. And as the British Grenadiers were rushing to capture this bridge, the 2 cannons we had up on Oswald's Knoll were murdering him with the grape shot. Now, how do we know that? We've dug up the grape shot there, but the day after the battle, a American doctor from Georgia left a diary, and he figures also in the Molly Pitcher story on the previous day. But he said the whole field between the hedgerow and that bridge was covered with red soldiers, grenadiers, best troops in the British Army that got mowed down by the grape shot from our cannons. And that was the most effective firing in the battle. Okay, question?
Can you describe General Lee's defense at his court-martial?
It's very interesting to read. As beloved President Abraham Lincoln said, you may have heard the quote, "He who has himself for a defense attorney has a fool for a client." He was swollen-headed and selfish and egotistical and was his own lawyer. His main defense was that what he's charged with is disobeying orders, conducting a shameful and disorderly retreat, and disrespect of General Washington. Now, there's no question he disrespected General Washington in some letters after the battle, and that was enough in what did convict him finally. But he contends that Washington gave him no direct orders to attack the British. Now, what had happened apparently is Washington told Lee, attack them if you can. Now, this ties in another Gettysburg story, that at the end of the first day at Gettysburg, General Lee told General Ewell, attack those Union troops on Cemetery Hill, if practicable, if you can. And he made the decision then that he couldn't because he didn't have enough artillery support. So at the court-martial, he asks or challenges the prosecutors to give him a copy of that order. And Colonel Hamilton, who probably wrote it, said, I can't find it. No, they kept a copy of every order Washington ever gave. Hamilton didn't produce it. And Lee is saying he understood that he was to attack if practicable, and the prosecution was saying he was ordered to attack. And since nobody could produce the document, thank you, Colonel Hamilton, the first charge he's really not guilty of, disobeying orders. Okay, the second charge of having a shameful and disorderly retreat, they took the shameful out. It was a disorderly retreat. He claims it wasn't his fault, the troops started retreating before. He should have gotten a medal for saving the army. And instead, about 2 o'clock, he came up to General Washington and said, "Sir, I have successfully withdrawn all my troops. What do you want me to do now?" And Washington said, "Go take a nap." And Lee was so mad that he sent a note to Washington saying, well, I thought I did a good thing. Why did you shame me like that? Washington sends out a congratulatory letter congratulating everybody except Molly Pitcher and General Lee for the successful battle. And Lee felt his honor was infringed, and so bad that he wrote this letter and got the date wrong on it, and sent that to Washington. That was the third charge, disrespect of the general. So when he's convicted, and by the way, the chairman of the court-martial board was General Sterling, Lord Alexander, who was Washington's second or third in command. The jury was stacked to begin with. The only supporters of Lee were General Oswald and General von Steuben. He gets dismissed from the army for a year. Knowing he was really guilty of something, they would have kicked him out. But they dismissed him for a year. At least it gets him out of our hair for a while. If he comes back, we'll send him down to South Carolina or something. Lee didn't like that decision. He goes back to Philadelphia and campaigns with Congress to get reinstated. He's such an SOB, they got tired of him. And finally in December, the Congress voted by 7 states to 6, because they're voting by states, to dismiss him forever from the Army. And he went back to an estate he had in Winchester, Virginia, and died before the war was over. So we got rid of General Lee for good. Anyway, answer your question in a roundabout way there. Okay, good, thank you. Okay, any other questions? Be glad to. Okay, if not, be glad to chat with you individually. Okay, one more over here. Yeah.
Just a comment. I read that Fatal Sunday book, which goes into great detail about the whole controversy. And apparently Lee asked to be court-martialed.
Yes.
It wasn't.
Yeah, there's no shame in a court-martial. My best example of that, and if you want one question, yes. That Scott's Willie Maxwell got accused of being drunk at the Battle of Germantown. And he asked for a court-martial to clear his name, and they gave evidence, and he was found not guilty, and Washington sent a case of beer to all his generals. It was not unusual. I would think that maybe 3 out of 4 times a court-martial will punish the person there, and this can get all the way down to a sentry falling asleep on guard duty. He asked for a court-martial to clear his name because he didn't think he was guilty of anything. But he was so egocentric, he didn't realize he was not really popular. And sorry to say, the judicial system sometimes works on popularity, but to answer the question over here, when you look at the court-martial, his defense goes for like 30 pages and makes sense. And that's why they only dismissed him from the Army for a year, and they changed some of the charges. But because the jury was stacked, because his part of the battle didn't go well, and he was definitely disrespectful of General Washington, they suspended him for a year. Very interesting character. You don't really hear much about him except at this battle, and that's the reason. Okay, well, thank you. Yes, more
He
here.
died very young. What did he die of? He's only 47 at the.
I don't know if he's got VD or what he's got. He was not legally ever married. When he was here during the French and Indian War, he had an Indian wife with a couple kids, apparently. And the Indians called him, because Indians will have names, you know, like Sitting Bull or whatever. He was called Boiling Water. And one theory is he had VD. Okay, what an ending to the talk.